Okay, thanks so much, Karen and Molly and Noemi, for helping pull this together. I'm really delighted to be here. And I just want to acknowledge before I get started that this work and the work that's coming up the pipeline have all been supported by the Alzheimer's Society of Canada. They're funding the project, and I'm very grateful for that. And Alzheimer's Group Inc., which is an organization here in Montreal that supports persons with dementia and their family caregivers, have been quite instrumental in helping us get advisory groups together for this project. So definitely want to acknowledge them. We also have some people on the line here who have been involved in the project, some of the CREGÉS student affiliates, Oluwabegnia Oyinlola, sorry, Yuping Ma, and a former CREGÉS student, Deandra Serrano. So I'm grateful because those of you who have done scoping reviews will know that they really do take a village. And as Kevin mentioned, that's what I'm going to be largely presenting today. So, just to give you a sense of what we're going to get through today, I'm going to start with a background on supported decision making. What is it? What do we know so far? What do we still need to know? I'm going to present some findings from a scoping review of the literature that included both the literature review and also, as Corinne said, consultations with lived experts, that's persons with dementia and family care partners. And then I'm happy to field questions and discussion points and also offer you a little preview into some of the next steps of this project. So as Corinne mentioned, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which actually was enacted in 2006, asserts that all persons have the right to participate in decisions that affect them, no matter what their ability. And so it's our responsibility to do what we can to support people's autonomy to participate in decisions that affect them. Interestingly, as has been typical in gerontology in general, what's been happening on the rights disability side of the world hasn't always been integrated into social gerontology. But rather recently, I'd say in the last 10 years, provinces across Canada are moving towards legislation of substitution to that of supported decision making, and I'll get into what that means. But finally, in a way, that Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is being thought of for people in the aging space who might be living with dementia, as an example. And much more locally, Quebec has had some recent policy shifts that are really requiring professionals, when they're doing assessments for capacity and questioning capacity, to be prioritizing rights and to be prioritizing autonomy to the extent possible, which means to look at supported decision-making possibilities. But of course, there's legislation and there's context, and then there's the practice of how do we actually enact that. And that's really what this project is trying to understand and to help direct. So substitutive decision-making is, I think, something that we think about and have been thinking about in Quebec for a long time. When we determine that somebody may not have the capacity to make a particular decision, and we get somebody else to substitute, mandatory, we call it, to substitute for those decision making. Supported decision making is getting us to think more specifically about the types of decisions that people may need support with and may be able to make, at least in part, with the support instead of having someone speak on their behalf. But of course, there's questions about stages of the condition. Someone at the beginning of dementia may have a different capacity and different need for support than someone in the sort of more moderate and even more advanced stages. There's a question of context. Where are these decisions being made? In the hospital, in the home, and people need different support in these different contexts. Of course, professionals play a role because we have to make determinations on how much we're looking to ensure that the person with dementia is in part involved in decisions. and when we think that we need somebody else to substitute. And there are probably a parameter of other things involved. So this is a rather complex ask of professionals to be thinking more about a model of supported decision making. And the question becomes, well, maybe different supports are needed for different types of decisions. For sure, different supports are needed by different stages of someone's condition, and maybe context plays a role. And that's really what motivated me to start looking and initiating this scoping review. So why would one conduct a scoping review? A scoping review is a good thing to do when you're trying to get a review, a comprehensive review of something. So in this case, what do we know about best practices for facilitating supported decision making, and what might be missing? What are the gaps? And in this review in particular, because it included consultations with persons with lived experience, are the gaps that we as researchers are identifying or that are there of importance? Like what are the priorities of people with dementia and their care partners? Because those are the real world issues that we need to move forward in terms of our knowledge base. So this was a two-stage process. The first stage was really to review what was in the literature and the scientific literature in and of itself. And the questions that we asked of the literature are what types of decisions are described, and also what seems to hinder and facilitate supported decision-making at various stages of dementia, acknowledging that things at the beginning may look different than things in kind of a more progressed state. And then what we wanted to do was consult advisory groups of people with lived experience with dementia and care partners, and get their understanding of how much the research findings align with their priorities and their experiences, and what may be missing of importance for persons with lived experience. So in terms of the literature component, once you start thinking about what substitute decision-making is and what decision-making is, you start realizing that it's a little bit esoteric, and we really didn't want to just use the word decision-making, which is a very cognitive thing. So we use broad words like making judgments, like exercising choices, like articulating preferences, because all of these things seem to have something to do with decision-making. And we also use broad terms for support, involvement, participation, engagement, really anything. And I should put a shout out also to Rim, who is the librarian at CREGÉS, who was incredibly helpful in getting us to think through these kinds of search terms and how we might find them in the literature. We also really wanted studies that included the person with dementia, because this is an attempt at centering the voice of the persons with dementia. It didn't need to be only persons with dementia. They could also have care partners and professionals, but there needed to be some component that looked at persons with dementia themselves and their perceptions and experiences. So then after we did the literature piece, we convened advisory groups. We had one group of persons with lived dementia that was 3 people, and another group of care partners that was 9 people. And we engaged in both open exploration and presented the literature and discussed key findings. So we had actually had a lot of debate about this. What should we do first? Should we present the findings first and get the focus on that? Or should we also take this as an opportunity to not constrain people by the findings and to have more of an open discussion, and then to present the findings? And of course, we also needed to be creative. We did it pictorially, and you'll see in some of the findings that I'm presenting here, we actually used some of the same images when we were in those consultation groups, just to give you a flavor. So in terms of what we found in the literature, most of the studies included persons with dementia along with somebody else. And sometimes it was hard to differentiate whose opinion or whose experience this was, but for the most part, we could entangle this somewhat. Not surprising, most of the studies are qualitative. That's really a good way of understanding something that's a little bit more in nuance. And so it wasn't surprising that the studies would have been in a qualitative state. And there were surprisingly more studies that focused on sort of institutional settings like hospitals and residential homes, long-term care homes. Still a good number, but less in the community and at home. So that's something to keep in mind for us in terms of the next steps. Because of course, the types of decisions you might need to make in a residential environment or in a hospital could be narrower than the kinds of decisions that you're making in daily life. Most studies did not report the stage of dementia of the person, so it was difficult and in a way impossible for us to start looking at facilitators and barriers at different stages. And that's something, again, that we're going to keep in mind as we move forward with our research. The ones that did report, which was only 8, the majority were at early mild stages. Again, in a way, not a surprise because it's a little bit easier to engage in an interview with somebody who still has relatively consistent verbal expression, and a few in the moderate stage. So that's something else to be thinking about as we move forward. There was good gendered representation, and there was it was, a lot of these studies are American and they use particular racial categories that we sort of stuck to. But you can see that there's certainly racial variety here, which is nice to see because there's lots of literature that talks about people's experiences and experiences of health having to do with social location, which includes race. And that is something we're committed to in the study that we're doing as well. So in terms of the types of decisions that were reflected in the literature, the most common kind of decisions that people seem to be looking at in terms of how they're made and the supports and the challenges of making those decisions were daily living decisions. But I would say more accurately, activities of daily living. So getting dressed, what to eat, what kind of routine to have, sort of more activities, whether to have a bath or not to have a bath. Those are really, we call them ADLs, I guess, in clinical work. And that's really what was represented most commonly. Some of that may have to do, again, with the fact that there are people, those kinds of decisions matter across whether you're at home or whether you're in institutional care. The other most common, frequent type of decision that was captured was healthcare. So do people want to go to hospital? Do they not want to go to hospital? Do they want this medical intervention? Do they not want this medical intervention? That was about just 38% of the studies looked at that. What was less frequent was social care, which is you want to go to a day program or not, or relocation issues, moving into long-term care. That was less frequently captured in terms of supported decision-making or participation in decision-making. And I'll come back to that because in our consultations, it came out as something that was important. And I was a bit surprised by this from financial decision-making, which we know is a very big issue for family members, certainly, and for persons with dementia as well. Only 3.6% of the research studies were looking at how to engage in supported decision-making in that type of decision. In terms of findings that were found to be helpful, and sorry, I went ahead here. So this is for people with dementia. Trust was a really important component for them. What they expressed in the literature is if we trust the person with whom we are discussing a decision, we're more likely to communicate a preference, and we're also more likely to be comfortable with that person making decisions on our behalf. So a close, trusting relationship with somebody is a really important thing in terms of making people feel confident in the decision-making process. Familiarity was also noted by persons with dementia. When I'm speaking with a familiar person, and I'm in a familiar space, I'm more able to express what it is that I need. So when it comes to practice, thinking about where we're asking people about their preferences and decision making is a really important component of this. Or maybe if we're in an institutional setting, it would be helping families in a familiar space facilitate a bit of a process that they can also transmit to us as professionals in more of an institutional environment. Effective communication that had to do with just nonverbal cues, being given encouragement, being, slowed down speech, these things people identified as really helpful, because sometimes if you're having difficulty with word finding, it's a little bit easier, of course, to be able to express yourself when people give you the time and maybe some cues to do so. And supportive tools were seen to be helpful, especially around activities of daily living. So, and this really, really did relate to, if you put food in front of me and you give me cues, I'll be able to feed myself. I'll be able to decide when it is that I want to choose to eat. If you give me some assistive devices, I may be able still to do a shower on my own, and therefore maybe also decide when to take that shower. So that came up as important for persons with dementia. In terms of caregivers, as you can see here, many of the same domains, but in some parts expressed slightly differently. So for people who are care partners, it's important that they trust the person with dementia's capacity. And that's complicated. And that may be where we have some challenges around really believing that the person still has some level of capacity to be involved in the decision-making process. And caregivers, when they weren't sure themselves, really felt confident that professionals would guide them in this decision. So the professionals could help them figure out when to include a person with dementia and when that person may no longer be able to engage in a conversation about decision making. And I think this really highlights why having more understanding about how to facilitate supported decision making, both for professionals and family caregivers, is going to prove to be quite important. The reiteration of familiarity here came where caregivers acknowledged that me knowing the person with dementia and having an understanding of their preferences helps me facilitate conversations with them, and also being in familiar environments helps them express what it is that they want to express. In terms of effective communication, they reiterated the notion that nonverbal cues, that slowing down speech helps the person with dementia stay involved. But caregivers also noted additionally that they needed professional support to allow that to happen. So when they were feeling pressured by professionals to make quick decisions, that became difficult for them to offer these supportive elements that help them keep their care partners in the conversation. And they also really found caregivers were talking more about communication tools, like that there are tools that can help people express themselves that they found useful in terms of supported decision making. Challenges, I think I kind of alluded to this already, that care partners expressed in the literature was just being time pressured, feeling like you got to make a decision quickly, and that made it very difficult to engage in supported decision making, because there's a lot of pressure to make a decision quickly, which is difficult to do when you know you need to slow down for somebody to get involved in a decision. Just like the responsibility of making a good decision. That's probably where that notion of, if I trust the person with dementia is able, then I feel a bit more comfortable that including them could lead us to a good decision. So this, again, it's very complicated, that to have that load of making a good decision, and whatever that means, means that sometimes caregivers question whether they should be involving the person with dementia. And really, this came up quite clearly, this notion of how and when to involve a person with dementia, that confusion, which I think is really the purpose of this whole project around, can we get a bit more clarity around how and when to involve somebody with dementia at different stages in decisions that affect them. So in terms of our lived experts, we had one group, which was rather small, with 3 persons with dementia, who I would say all fit into the mild to mild moderate stage of dementia. So certainly could express themselves in a narrative form. And that's something we're going to be building on in our larger project, where we're going to try and get more of a range. 2 lived with partners and 1 lived alone. And 2 had their partners who were providing care to them, spouses, and 1 had an adult child. So a bit of a range of caregivers there. From the care partners, they, I would say, represented decision-making at a more moderate and advanced stage. So there were 9 of them. A number had already had to make the decision about relocation, and in some cases also had someone who had already passed away at more advanced stages. So the 2 groups were really thinking, I would say, about different stages of dementia when we were talking together, which may be why some of the decisions came out slightly differently for the 2 groups. All of these were women. So the care partners raise 2 things that raise relocation, medical aid in dying, and decisions about daily living as critical. And so reminding all of you that this notion of relocation decision-making wasn't actually captured a lot in the literature on supported decision-making. And of course, MAID is a very newly available decision for people who have dementia and their families. And in the case of these family members, I think there was a lot of lamenting as to, we're not really in a position to participate in MAID anymore because our family members are now well too advanced to be able to articulate in advance what they might want. But this is certainly going to be something that emerges as an important area for supported decision-making in dementia care. Some of the things that they suggested impacted their capacity to enact supported decision-making was double exclusion. A lot of them said, I'm barely included myself in decisions. I feel, especially around relocation, that I barely have a say. So how could I possibly engage in supported decision-making with the person with dementia? I'm barely included myself. And that, I think, is a critical element to supported decision-making. What's the context in which we're expecting this to happen? Because that's going to make a big difference. It's not all about the didactic kind of interaction between the person and their care partner. Caregivers also really talked about fluctuating capacity and the constant need to adjust. Last week, this worked. This week, that works. So they're constantly thinking about how to reposition themselves to support their person with dementia, which means that there's a fluctuation element to supported decision-making that caregivers are recognizing in their daily work. And when they didn't trust professionals, or they didn't trust a professional's competence, it was really important. It was really difficult for them to get the guidance that they needed to support the person with dementia decision making. So they really need trusted peers, organizations, and professionals to help them sort out the complexities of how to support decision making, or how to enact supported decision making, which means we as professionals really need to understand that process. People with dementia really focused on daily decision making, but it was much, much broader than activities of daily living. they were talking about preserving value-based living choices, interests and activities, things that related to their sense of self. So they were really talking about, I want to keep on being able to write, so I need to help myself continue to have that capacity and use tricks to be able to do that so that I can still make the decision to be involved in that activity or read or go on a bike ride. These very, very important activities of daily living. And it's kind of the intersection of when you're able to do it and when you can adjust it, you can choose to continue doing it. I think that's what they were really getting at. They also had some really interesting things to say about decisions. When you're making a complex decision, like what kind of care to receive or how to manage financial matters, that you really need space for reflection and a common understanding. So this takes time and space, and they need more of that, in fact, because of processing issues. And you also really, they express the need to share and express their concerns without being interrupted or without people initially going into problem solving. So, as an example, one of the women was talking about she had expressed her loneliness living at home, and she just wanted to be able to express that and maybe unpack it a little bit around what that meant for her. But her family automatically went to, well, maybe you should move. And that caused her to stop expressing her feelings of being alone. So when you're participating in shared decision making, you also need to be assured that people will give you the time and space to come to those conclusions or to move your reflections into some kind of action at your own time. Otherwise, you shut down. And it's also about, I guess this is the pacing of it, adjusting expectations at your own pace. A lot of people were expressing, I know I'm not going to be able to do all of these things. And I need to help people to help move with me, to help me gain that understanding that I may no longer be able to do this, rather than to jump in and take over without bringing me along. So people were really expressing that processing of these things helps them stay involved in decision-making processes. In terms of overlap, it was interesting to see that the process of decision making for caregivers and people with dementia are slightly different, because caregivers see decisions through a lens of responsibility and permanency of outcome, a good decision. Whereas people with dementia are really trying to make decisions that allow them and enable them to continue experiencing a sense of self and have personal meaning. So they're oriented in a very different way. And how does that play itself out when both these people are coming to the table to make decisions? And in addition, caregivers are kind of future focused. They're always anticipating that next decision and how to adapt to change, whereas persons with dementia are rather present focused and thinking again about in the moment decision making and what's important to them. So how do we grapple with those two orientation realities when we come to the table to help people and support them in their decision making process? So I would say that the scoping review in many ways elicited more questions than answers. But one of the things I mentioned before is that we had people at different stages. The people with dementia were at sort of an earlier stage, and the family members were talking about decisions made at a later stage, which is why relocation may have come up for them and not for the people with dementia. So I think that might have been why those two distinctive things emerged. But nonetheless, it's going to be really important as we move forward with our research to be thinking and very purposefully trying to talk to people at different stages of dementia to the best of our abilities and to be able to understand the things that are of utmost importance to them and to really map that onto what might be different about the literature. And I also think that this notion of what's behind decisions, like the orientation of decisions, is a really important thing for us to be thinking about. I don't have an answer per se, but I think it's really important as we move forward in understanding supported decision making to be unpacking a little bit more about, well, if people are coming from totally different orientations, how do we bring them together to help support each other in what it is they need to make the decisions that are important for people with dementia? So effectively, this is a first step of a larger project. And the next step of that project is recruiting people with dementia at various stages of the condition and engaging them in more in-depth discussions about the kinds of things that are important to them, the decisions that are important to them. And we're going to do this both verbally, but also by using photo voice, which is the activity of helping people take pictures that represent something important to them, and then helping them to unpack what the image of those pictures mean to them in terms of supported decision making. And we have found, I've used photo voice with people in long-term care before who definitely have varied cognitive capacities. And it's very interesting that sometimes people can't give you a narrative that connects together, but they can tell you that a picture is important and they can tell you why that picture is important. And from that, you can tap into, with some interpretation, what that might say in terms of what's important around supported decision making. So I'm really looking forward to the next step of the project. We have a few people who have been recruited, who we haven't interviewed yet. And it's going to be a little bit of a learning by doing. But as you'll see from the literature, we keep on looking at and thinking about, either we don't track the kinds of stages of dementia people are in when we make research about supported decision making, and or we're getting people at earlier stages because it's easier to get people to talk in an interview at that stage. But if we're really going to think about supported decision making across the continuum of care, we have to get creative also in research around how to engage people at those stages around expressing themselves. So in a way, the research is meant to be supported inclusion, which is kind of in parallel to supportive decision making. So it'll be quite interesting, and I think it's going to be a bit learning by doing, and I'm really looking forward to having something to report back to you when that's done.